So somewhere off the coast of Iceland right now, buried about maybe 6 inches deep in this freezing pitch black mud of the seafloor, is an animal that was literally born before the American Civil War.
Yeah, it's pretty staggering to think about.
Right. And it doesn't have a brain. It has no face. It hasn't moved a single inch in over 200 years.
Not an inch.
And yet, this silent, totally invisible creature somehow holds the secret to understanding some of the most complex human systems on the entire planet.
It really does. I mean, it completely challenges our entire framework of, well, what an animal even is.
Yeah, totally.
Because when we usually look at our relationship with the animal kingdom, there's a face involved.
Right, you look a cow in the eye.
Exactly. Or you see a salmon thrashing in a net.
Mm.
And we instantly understand that dynamic, right? The farmer and the livestock, or the hunter and the prey.
We get that intuitively.
We do. But today, we're looking at organisms that force us to question the very line between a wild animal we hunt, a crop we cultivate, and this is the crazy part, a high-end luxury good that we actively brand.
Welcome directly into this deep dive. We are so glad you are joining us today, because our mission today is to explore two of the most profoundly weird, wonderful, and honestly historically vital creatures on Earth.
Oysters and clams.
Yes, oysters and clams. You are joining us to unpack how these bizarre little bivalve mollusks, these soft-bodied invertebrates locked inside two hinged shells, basically blur absolutely every line we've ever drawn around food and ecology.
They really do blur everything.
I completely blur the line between wild game and cultivated crop, and culturally, too, they blur the line between luxury decadence and straight-up working-class survival.
And that trajectory, that blurring, is precisely what we're going to be mapping out today for you.
Right, so where do we even start?
Well, we're going to explore the biology of an animal whose entire evolutionary strategy is simply staying perfectly still.
Which sounds like a terrible strategy, honestly.
It sounds awful, but it works. And then we'll look at the human history of gathering them, right? And how that relationship shifted from this sustainable indigenous harvest to a pretty brutal industrial extraction.
Yeah, the history there is intense.
It is. We'll also dive into the bizarre world of farming an animal that you don't actually have to feed.
It still just breaks my brain.
I know, we'll get into that. And finally, we'll look at the profound moral and philosophical lessons that these quiet little filter feeders offer us. Because what's truly fascinating here is how the less an animal resembles us, the more it actually reveals about human assumptions of value.
Oh, I love that. The less it looks like us, the more it reveals about us. That's so good. So let's start right at the beginning with the biology.
Let's do it.
Let's talk about the taxonomy, right? The family tree. Because our sources point out that while we easily lump oysters and clams together on, a crushed ice seafood tower at a fancy restaurant, they're actually on distinct evolutionary paths.
That's very distinct, yeah.
So they both belong to the kingdom Animalia and the phylum Mollusca, which, by the way, means an oyster is more closely related to a highly intelligent octopus than it is to a fish.
Yes. And it's a brilliant taxonomic reality check.
Wait, really? An octopus?
Yeah. An octopus and an oyster actually share that ancient molluscan lineage, which stretches way back, like over 500 million years to the Cambrian explosion.
Wow.
But while the octopus evolved into what we might call like a software solution, right?
Oh, meaning like intelligence.
Exactly. It shed its heavy external shell in favor of massive neural networks, camouflage, behavioral problem solving. It got smart. But bivalves went the entirely opposite direction.
They went all in on hardware.
100% hardware.
Right. They essentially said, we're not going to try to outsmart the predators. We're just going to build impenetrable fortresses.
That is exactly what they did.
And from there, oysters and clams drop down into the class Bivalvia, meaning they have two hinged shells, but they actually split at the order level. So oysters are in the order Ascreta, and the hard clams that we're mostly focusing on today are in the order Venerita.
Exactly. And this is where their evolutionary divergence gets really interesting.
Tell me.
Let's look at the eastern oyster, scientifically known as Crassostria virginica. Early oyster ancestors might have had a little bit of mobility, but true oysters evolved a highly specialized, permanent strategy of attachment.
Permanent attachment, like they do not move.
They do not move.
Yeah.
When they're microscopic, they find a hard surface, they secrete this biological calcium-based cement, and they literally bolt themselves down for the rest of their lives.
That's wild.
And ideally, they want to cement themselves to other oyster shells.
Which makes them essentially the ocean's apartment developers, right?
That is a perfect way to put it.
Like, as generations grow on top of previous generations, they build these massive three-dimensional reef infrastructures.
Yes, exactly.
So they don't just live in the environment. They physically create the architecture of the environment. They externalize their success to build these sprawling cities that end up sheltering, crabs, fish, worms, and just countless other species.
They are the builders.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have the clams.
Right.
The northern quahog mercenaria.
Oh.
Now, they internalize their success.
How so?
Well, instead of building upward into the turbulent, predator-filled water column where the oysters are, the clam developed a powerful, muscular foot.
A foot.
Yeah, a foot. And it uses that foot to physically burrow deep into the soft sediment, like the sand or the mud. It completely hides.
So the oyster is the developer, and the clam is just a total introvert hiding under the covers.
Exactly. But it still needs to eat and breathe, obviously. So it developed these long, fleshy tubes called siphons.
Oh, those are the little periscopes they stick up?
Yes, those are the periscopes. The siphons reach up through the mud to the water above. The clam draws water in through one siphon, filters out all the oxygen in the food, and then pushes the exhaust water back out the other siphon.
And it does all this while remaining totally buried.
Completely buried and protected by the surrounding seafloor.
Man, it really is evolutionary genius. But here's the part from the research that genuinely breaks my brain.
Yeah.
Neither of them has a brain.
None at all.
Like, I was looking through the anatomy charts and the source material we gathered, and you see, gills, a mantle, these huge adductor muscles that hold the shell shut, a stomach, gonads, but there's absolutely no vertebrate brain.
No central processing unit.
Right. There's no CPU coordinating all this. How does a faceless blob process sensory data without a central brain? Like, how does it know to close?
That's where we kind of have to reframe our whole understanding of intelligence. For bivalves, intelligence isn't cognitive. It's entirely physiological.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means they possess decentralized nerve networks. They have these clusters of nerves called ganglia distributed throughout their bodies.
Ganglia.
Okay, right. So instead of routing all sensory input up to a central brain to make a decision, their tissues just react autonomously.
So they're essentially just an exposed nerve of the ocean.
That's a great way to put it, because at a cellular level, their mantle, which is the fleshy lip right at the edge of the shell, is absolutely packed with sensory receptors.
Yeah.
Yeah. They can detect microscopic shifts in water temperature and salinity. They even have chemical receptors that act kind of like a sense of smell.
They can smell things underwater.
Basically, yeah. They can detect the specific amino acids released by a predatory sea star or a blue crab in the water nearby.
So they smell the crab.
And when those chemical cues hit the ganglia, the neural pathway triggers the adductor muscle to just snap the shell shut instantly.
Oh.
They don't think about the threat, right? There's no fear. Their biology just automatically executes a survival protocol based purely on the chemistry of the water.
But that biological vulnerability, the fact that they're permanently bolted in place or, buried and just reacting to whatever washes over them, that creates a massive, glaring logistical problem.
Oh, a huge one.
Right. Because if you're an oyster bolted to a rock or a clam under 6 inches of mud and you literally cannot walk over to the oyster next door, how do you reproduce?
It requires what might be the ultimate biological trust fall.
A trust fall. I love that.
It really is. Because they're immobilized, courtship or, physical mating is entirely impossible. So they rely on a process called broadcast spawning.
Which sounds completely chaotic.
Oh, it's the definition of biological chaos.
Oh.
But it's highly synchronized chaos.
Okay, how does it work?
Well, when the environmental cues align perfectly, usually it's a rapid warming of the water temperature in the spring or summer. Combined with very specific tidal and lunar phases, adult bivalves simply release millions of eggs and sperm directly into the water column simultaneously.
Just right into the open water?
Right. The fertilization happens externally, completely adrift in the ocean currents.
See, the sources emphasize that this is just a sheer numbers game.
Absolutely.
A single female oyster can release tens of millions of eggs in one single spawning event.
Tens of millions.
And the evolutionary logic is brutal because almost all of them are going to die.
Yeah, the vast, vast majority.
They'll remain unfertilized, or they'll be filtered out and eaten by other animals, or the tide will just, wash them out into the open, deep ocean where they can't survive.
It's a strategy of infinite quantity over individual care. Think about mammals, right?
Right.
We invest massive biological energy into just a few offspring, and we protect them fiercely.
Right.
Bivalves invest virtually zero energy into parenting.
Mm.
Instead, they produce an astronomical number of lottery tickets.
That's such a good analogy. Lottery ticket.
And the microscopic few that actually win the lottery, the ones that get fertilized, they develop into free-swimming planktonic larvae.
And this is the larval journey, right?
Right.
Which is so fascinating because it's the only time in an oyster's entire life that it gets to move freely.
Yeah, they're one big road trip.
Exactly. They drift around in the plankton for 2 to 3 weeks, propelled by these tiny hair-like cilia. But for the oyster larva, the clock is ticking really loudly.
Yes, it is.
They eventually reach a developmental stage where they become competent to settle, which means they're getting too heavy to float, and they absolutely must find a hard substrate to attach to.
And this is where those chemical receptors we talked about become crucial.
Oh, the smelling.
Exactly. The larvae are actively tasting or smelling the water as they sink, looking for the specific calcium carbonate chemical signature of adult oyster shells.
So they're looking for their parents, essentially.
Right. They strongly prefer to settle on the shells of their ancestors. And once they find it, they secrete that biological cement they attach permanently, and they are officially called spat.
Spat.
And from that moment on, they will never move again.
Wow. And
Yeah.
clam larvae do a similar thing, right?
Very similar pelagic drift, yeah. But when they settle to the bottom, instead of cementing, they extend that tiny muscular foot and just start digging.
And if they survive that incredibly precarious settling process, their longevity is just staggering.
Oh, it's unparalleled.
I mean, eastern oysters might live a few years, maybe a decade, under absolutely perfect conditions, but clam species redefine our entire understanding of lifespan. Which brings us back to that ocean quahog we talked about in the very beginning in Iceland.
Arctica islandica.
Yes, tell
Yes.
us about Ming.
Oh, me. Okay, so
Yeah.
because they live in such incredibly cold water, their metabolism is incredibly slow. Researchers actually age them by counting the growth rings on their shells, much like counting the rings of a tree.
Wow, okay.
And they frequently find individuals living well over 100 years. But the oldest recorded, nicknamed Ming the clam,
Ming the clam, I love it.
was 507 years old.
507 years.
It had been sitting in the sediment, quietly filtering water, since the year 1499.
That is just mind-blowing. Like, it outlived empires just by sitting in the mud.
Completely oblivious to all of human history happening above it.
And that longevity really points to the quiet, invisible labor they perform, which is a theme we're going to see woven through this entire deep dive.
Absolutely.
Because they process so much water over such a long time, they really are the foundational workers of the coast. So let's break down how that filter feeding engine actually works mechanically.
It is an elegant piece of bioengineering. So as water flows over the bivalve's gills, the gills serve a dual purpose.
Okay.
Obviously, they extract oxygen for respiration, just like fish gills, but they're also covered in microscopic beating hairs called cilia, and they're coated in this sticky mucus.
Mucus nap.
Yes. As the water passes through, tiny particles of phytoplankton, algae, and suspended organic matter get trapped in that mucus net.
And then the cilia basically act like a microscopic conveyor belt, right? Just moving that food-laden mucus right up to the animal's mouth.
Precisely. And in doing so, they are actively pulling excess nutrients and suspended sediments out of the water column.
Which is huge for the environment.
It's massive. An adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a single day.
Wait, 50 gallons, one oyster.
One oyster. Now, when you multiply that by a reef containing millions of oysters, you basically have a massive biological water treatment plant.
Wow.
They clarify the water. And water clarity is essential because it allows sunlight to penetrate deeper into the bay, which allows critical habitats like underwater seagrass meadows to photosynthesize and grow.
And while the oysters are, building reefs upward, absorbing wave energy, and preventing coastal erosion, the clams are doing this quiet labor downward.
Yes.
Our sources talk about bioturbation.
Bioturbation. Great word.
It is a great word. So as clams burrow, feed, and excrete waste, they cycle nutrients. They're basically constantly moving energy from the floating plankton down into the seafloor food web, effectively fertilizing the mud and feeding the crabs, birds, and bottom-dwelling fish.
They are the ultimate stabilizing force in a coastal ecosystem, period.
But that stationary, predictable nature, the fact that they come in their own protective, heavy-duty bowl and literally never run away, that made them the ultimate prehistoric convenience food.
Oh, without a doubt. The easiest hunting trip ever.
Which takes us right into Section 3 of our deep dive, from middens to markets, exploring the human harvest.
Let's do it.
Because the human relationship with bivalves goes back to the absolute dawn of our species. The archaeological record is filled with shell middens.
Shell middens, yeah.
Which are these massive accumulations of discarded shells left by ancient coastal communities. And I think we need to frame this carefully because early European archaeologists often dismiss these middens as just random, primitive trash dumps.
And that was a tremendous underestimation of indigenous engineering.
Totally.
The sources we have from the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, they paint a vastly different, highly complex picture of what these were.
Yeah, they do.
We're looking at indigenous peoples in Florida, like the ancestors of the Calusa, who are harvesting shellfish as far back as 14,000 years ago.
14,000 years.
Right as the sea levels were stabilizing after the last ice age.
And the scale of what they built is almost impossible to picture in your head. Like, the Smithsonian highlights sites like Mound Key in Florida. Archaeologists estimate that Mound Key contains 18.6 billion oyster shells.
18.6 billion.
And another site, Shell Mound near Cedar Key, contains an estimated 2.1 billion shells.
It's staggering.
It really is. And these weren't just piles of refuse where people tossed shells over their shoulder after dinner. They were engineered landscapes. Indigenous communities used the shells to literally build islands, elevating their villages above storm surges, constructing massive watercourts, canals, and ceremonial temple mounds.
Exactly. You do not accumulate 18.6 billion shells through just passive scavenging.
No way.
It represents a highly sophisticated multi-generational ecological management system. Indigenous harvesting was built on this intimate, precise understanding of tidal cycles, lunar phases, seasonal spawning patterns, and most importantly, the carrying capacity of the local bays.
And crucially, there's strong archaeological evidence that many of these traditional practices actually involved intentionally returning the empty shells back to the water.
Which goes back to the biology we just talked about.
Right. They understood, even without microscopes, that oyster larvae absolutely need hard calcium carbonate substrate to settle on. So by returning the shell, they were actively maintaining the nursery for future generations.
It was a localized, completely sustainable partnership.
But as European colonization accelerated and eventually the Industrial Revolution took hold, that relationship fundamentally shattered.
It broke completely.
And the technological evolution of bivalve harvesting is very different from the history of fin fishing.
Yes, it's a totally different trajectory. Think about catching a cod or a tuna, right? Human technology evolved to chase a moving target.
We invented better nets, sharper hooks, faster, more agile boats.
Exactly. But shellfishing isn't about the chase. The animal is completely stationary. So the technology didn't evolve to chase, it evolved to reach.
Reach. I really like that distinction.
It's a timeline of increasing extraction efficiency. For thousands of years, the harvest was limited by human anatomy hands, digging sticks, maybe woven baskets.
Which inherently capped the harvest at what a community could physically reach at low tide and carry on their backs.
Right. Then, European settlers brought iron rakes and hoes, which allowed diggers to work the mudflats significantly faster.
And then, in the 1700s, we see the widespread adoption of oyster tongs.
Ah, the tongs.
Yeah, these are basically two long, rake-like heads joined in the middle like a pair of giant scissors, sometimes 20 feet long.
They're huge.
A person standing in a small skiff could reach down into much deeper subtidal waters and pinch a cluster of oysters right off the bottom.
So the tongs expanded the harvest zone into deeper water, but you were still ultimately limited by the physical muscle power of the person pulling the tongs.
Right, and the carrying capacity of just a small sailboat.
But then we crossed the tipping point.
The big schist.
Yeah. In the 19th century, human technology moved from reaching to scraping. The invention and widespread deployment of the heavy metal oyster dredge changed the entire ecological balance of the coasts.
Yeah, the dredge is a brutal piece of equipment.
Brutal.
It's basically a heavy iron frame with jagged teeth along the bottom attached to a chain mesh bag. Instead of a human carefully feeling around with tongs and, picking a few oysters off the top of the reef, a boat just drops this heavy iron mouth to the seafloor and drags it.
It just blindly scrapes up absolutely everything in its path.
And the introduction of the dredge coincided with this sort of perfect storm of industrialization.
The steam engine.
Right. You didn't just have the dredge pulling up massive quantities. You had the invention of steam-powered boats. Now, harvesters didn't have to rely on the wind anymore.
A steam-powered skipjack could drag massive, heavy dredges back and forth across a reef relentlessly, all day and all night, regardless of the weather.
And simultaneously, you have the invention of the commercial cannery, which meant oyster meat was suddenly shelf-stable. It wouldn't rot in 2 days.
Huge game changer.
Combine that with the expansion of the railroad network and refrigerated rail cars packed with ice. Suddenly, an oyster pulled from the Chesapeake Bay on a Monday could be eaten in a saloon in Chicago or St. Louis on a Wednesday.
The local ecosystem was suddenly feeding a national commodity market.
And the demand just exploded. Throughout the 1800s, oysters weren't a luxury. They were literally the cheapest protein available.
They were street food.
Yeah. Tavern snacks sold from push carts in New York and London like hot dogs are today.
But the ecological cost of feeding that machine was catastrophic.
Catastrophic.
The iron dredges didn't just take the adult oysters. They physically smashed and leveled the three-dimensional architecture of the reefs we talked about earlier.
Right, the apartment buildings.
Exactly. They scraped away the old ancestral shell substrate that the microscopic spat so desperately needed to survive.
So we didn't just overfish the animals, we literally strip-mined their homes.
We destroyed the nursery.
And when you read the historical accounts from the early explorers, it's honestly tragic. Like when Henry Hudson navigated into New York Harbor in 1609, he sailed into an estuary containing 350 square miles of oyster reefs.
350 square miles. Just imagine that.
And when Captain John Smith explored the Chesapeake Bay in 1607, the reefs were so massive they literally broke the surface of the water at low tide. Ships routinely ran aground on mountains of living oysters.
And the water was crystal clear because billions of bivalves were filtering it every few days.
But within a century of industrial dredging, combined with massive urban sewage pollution and the introduction of devastating oyster diseases like MSX and dermo, those ancient ecosystems just collapsed.
They fell apart.
Today, wild oyster populations in places like the Chesapeake and New York Harbor are estimated at roughly 1% of their historical levels. 1%.
It's devastating. And as a result, the water grew murky, the seagrass died off, and the entire architecture of the bays changed.
And that collapse, it forced a profound human reckoning. We realized that the wild coastal commons were not an infinite magical resource. If we had scraped the bays completely flat, but we still wanted to eat oysters and clams,
Which you definitely did.
we had to figure out how to grow them ourselves. Which brings us to Section 4, Farming the Tide. Aquaculture and the climate threat.
Modern bivalve aquaculture is such a fascinating hybrid. It's an animal farm, obviously, but conceptually, it operates much more like a terrestrial garden.
Which is the most amazing part to me. Like, if you farm cows, you have to clear thousands of acres of land, grow massive amounts of corn and soy, harvest it, process it, and actively feed it to the cattle.
Massive inputs.
Right. Even if you farm carnivorous fish like salmon in ocean pens, you have to catch smaller wild forage fish, grind them into pellets, and feed the salmon every single day. But with adult oysters and clams, you never feed them a single thing.
That is the defining feature of bivalve aquaculture. It is an unfed farming system. The ocean itself does all the feeding.
It's so elegant.
It is. The farmer just provides the structure, the cages or the netting, and the ecosystem provides the naturally occurring phytoplankton. And because there are zero external feed inputs, no fresh water required for irrigation, and no fertilizer, organizations like NOAA and the UN consistently highlight bivalve aquaculture as one of the most environmentally sustainable forms of animal protein production on the planet.
Okay, but let's actually walk through the mechanics, because I know it's not as simple as just throwing some shells in the water and walking away.
Definitely not.
Since the wild populations are so depleted, farmers can't rely on wild spawning anymore. The entire modern industry is propped up by these high-tech indoor hatcheries.
Exactly. The life cycle now begins in a laboratory setting. Hatchery technicians manage adult brood stocks, which are often selectively bred for fast growth or disease resistance.
Right.
They manipulate the water temperature in these tanks to basically trick the bivalves into spawning.
Right.
Now, when those microscopic larvae hatch, the hatchery actually does have to feed them.
Okay, so the babies get fed.
Yes. The hatcheries grow these massive, bubbling, floor-to-ceiling clear cylinders of specialized, highly nutritious microalgae to feed the larvae until they're ready to settle.
And instead of letting them settle on big, clunky clusters of wild shells like they do in nature, the hatcheries actually get them to settle on tiny, microscopic fragments of ground-up shell.
Right.
And this creates what they call a single-seed oyster, which grows beautifully round and uniform, which is perfect for the high-end half-shell market.
Once those spat reach a viable size, they are moved out of the hatchery and planted out in the open water. And this is where the serious physical labor begins.
Oh, yeah.
For oysters, farmers use a wide variety of gear. You might see off-bottom cages resting on the seafloor, or floating mesh bags bobbing on the surface, or rack and bag systems tied to rebar in the intertidal zone.
And one of the most vital, labor-intensive parts of oyster farming is a process called tumbling.
The tumbling, yes.
Yeah, I saw videos of this in our research. Farmers will regularly haul these heavy mud cake bags out of the water and run the oysters through what looks like a giant rotating bingo cage.
Yes. Or they'll just violently shake the bags by hand.
Why are they roughing up their own crop? It looks like they're trying to damage them.
It's all about controlling the shell shape. See, if you leave an oyster alone in a cage, it naturally tends to grow long, flat, and thin as it just reaches for the water flow.
Okay.
But the high-end raw bar market doesn't want a flat, skinny oyster. So by physically tumbling them, the farmer intentionally chips off the fragile new shell growth at the edges.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this forces the oyster to stop growing outward and instead grow a deeper, more robust cup-like shell to protect itself.
So it builds depth instead of width.
Exactly. And a deep cup holds a plumper, fatter meat, and much more of that delicious briny liquor.
That is so clever. And clam farming is a completely different operation, right?
Totally different. The clams go right down into the mud. Farmers take the tiny hatchery-raised clam seed and literally plant it in least sediment beds on the sea floor.
Just like a garden.
Exactly like a garden.
Yeah.
But because juvenile clams are incredibly vulnerable to predators, I mean, blue crabs will crush them, cow-nose rays will literally suck them right out of the mud, diving birds will pick them off.
It's a rough neighborhood.
Very rough. So the farmers have to roll out these massive, heavy sheets of anti-predator netting over the mudflats, staking it down deep to protect the crop while it grows for 2 to 4 years.
It's just a tremendous amount of infrastructure deployed directly into a highly dynamic marine environment.
It really is.
Okay, I want to push back on something here, though. The industry loves the word sustainable, and yes, we established they don't use feed or fertilizer. But if you're deploying thousands of heavy plastic mesh bags, miles of synthetic rope, PVC pipes, and plastic netting into a bay, I mean, that gear breaks down in the sun, it gets ripped apart by winter storms. Aren't we essentially introducing massive amounts of microplastics directly into the coastal environment?
There's a very valid critique.
And furthermore, if you pack 1 million oysters into a tiny 1-acre lease, they're constantly eating and excreting. Our sources mention they produce what's called pseudofeces.
Right, pseudofeces.
Doesn't that concentrate so much biological waste in one spot that it can literally suffocate the mud beneath the cages?
You're absolutely right. High-density aquaculture is not zero impact. It is the frontier of the ecological debate around aquaculture right now. The plastic gear degradation is a known, serious issue, and progressive farmers are desperately trying to transition to biodegradable materials, though they often lack the durability to survive a serious storm.
So it's a trade-off.
Exactly. And regarding the benthic impact, the accumulation of feces and pseudofeces smothering the seafloor, that definitely occurs when farms are sited in areas with poor tidal flushing. It really highlights that sustainable doesn't mean invincible. You still have to respect the carrying capacity of the water.
And that actually leads to the ultimate vulnerability. Because they are filter feeders stuck in cages, if the water goes bad, the crop goes bad.
Instantly.
And this introduces the existential threat looming over the entire bivalve industry, the climate crisis. Specifically, ocean acidification.
Ocean acidification is arguably the most direct, terrifying, and immediate threat to these organisms. Period.
How does it actually work?
To understand the mechanism, we have to look at the chemistry. As human activity pumps gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the oceans act as a massive carbon sink. They absorb about 1/4 of all that CO2.
Right. And when carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it reacts with the water molecules to form carbonic acid, which releases hydrogen ions, which lowers the overall pH of the ocean, making it more acidic.
You got it. But here is the critical part for bivalves specifically. Those extra hydrogen ions aggressively bind with free carbonate ions in the water.
Okay.
And carbonate ions are the exact chemical building blocks that an oyster or clam larva needs to pull from the water to precipitate calcium carbonate and build its shell.
Oh no, so the human-induced chemical reaction is literally stealing the building blocks out of the water before the baby oyster can even use them.
Exactly. When the water becomes too saturated with dissolved carbon, it actually becomes corrosive to the baby bivalves.
Corrosive.
Yes. The microscopic larvae are expending massive amounts of energy trying to build their very first highly fragile shells, but the building blocks just aren't there anymore.
They're just exhausted.
Or worse, the water is so corrosive that it dissolves the shell faster than the larva can even build it. They exhaust their microscopic energy reserves, they fail to form a shell, and they die in massive numbers.
The research notes mention that this isn't some abstract future threat, right? This already happened.
Yes. It nearly collapsed the entire Pacific Northwest oyster hatchery industry back in the late 2000s.
You just wiped it out.
Almost completely. Deep, naturally carbon-rich ocean water upwelled along the coast of Washington and Oregon, entered the intake pipes of the hatcheries, and literally dissolved billions of larvae overnight.
Yeah.
The farmers had absolutely no idea what was happening until scientists came in and tested the water chemistry.
That is a stark, terrifying reminder that while shellfish farming is highly efficient, it's exquisitely sensitive to macro-environmental shifts.
Extremely sensitive.
And that intense reliance on water quality doesn't just threaten the survival of the bivalve itself. Because these animals filter whatever's in the water directly into their tissues, this vulnerability threatens human survival the very moment we decide to put them on our plates.
Which is the perfect entry into Section 5.
Yes, Section 5, the plate and the danger. We're moving from the water to the table and exploring culinary identity and the intense health stakes involved.
Let's do it.
Let's compare their culinary vibes, because oysters and clams occupy very different psychological spaces in our food culture, right?
Totally different.
Oysters are deeply theatrical, they're dramatic, they are the ultimate expression of miroir.
Right, miroir being the marine equivalent of the wine world's terroir.
Yes. The idea that you eat a raw oyster and you are literally tasting a snapshot of the exact bay it grew in.
It's highly specific.
You taste the specific salinity of the tide, the distinct lipid profile of the local algae it ate, the minerality of the bedrock. They are slurped raw, naked as individuals. Eating an oyster is a performance.
It really is. Clams, on the other hand, are culinary communalists.
Communalists, I like that.
Yeah.
While you might eat, small little neck clams or cherry stones raw on the half shell occasionally, the clam's true culinary identity is almost always in the pot.
Comfort food.
Exactly. They are the foundation of deep, warm comfort foods. They go into thick New England clam chowders, bubbling with heavy cream, salt pork, and potatoes, or Manhattan chowders with bright tomatoes and celery. Oh man, making me hungry.
They're steamed by the bucketful for beachside clam bakes, or tossed with garlic, chili flakes, and white wine for a classic linguine alla vongole. If the oyster is a sharp solo aria, the clam is a warm, rich chorus.
I love that contrast. And the arc of the oyster's reputation over time is just a wild sociological ride. We talked about how it started as ancient indigenous subsistence and architecture, and then became cheap working-class street food in the 1800s.
Right.
Then, purely because humans over-extracted them and they became scarce, the exact same animal transitioned into a rare, elite luxury item. It became associated with champagne, wealth, and status.
And now, in the 21st century, it's shapeshifted again.
Right, into a branded, eco-conscious symbol of regenerative aquaculture.
It's had quite the PR journey, yet despite that glossy, sustainable branding, the core consumption method of the oyster eating it raw, essentially alive, right out of the shell, remains inherently biologically risky.
Okay, so I have to ask the question that I know people think about but rarely say out loud at a fancy raw bar.
Go for it.
Why on earth do we risk eating raw filter feeders?
It's a fair question.
I mean, you're taking an animal whose entire biological purpose is to suck in and trap whatever is floating in the coastal waters, including bacteria, viruses, and runoff, and you're just swallowing the whole animal raw. Why do we do this?
Well, psychologically, it is a culinary thrill, right? It's the rush of tasting the ocean so directly. But the health risks are severe, they are well documented, and they absolutely scale with environmental degradation.
Yeah.
Because bivalves concentrate whatever is in the water, they highly concentrate human pathogens. The CDC issues very real, stringent warnings about this.
The big one everyone fears is Vibrio.
Yes. Specifically Vibrio vilificus and Vibrio perihemolyticus. These are naturally occurring bacteria that thrive in warmer coastal waters.
So as ocean temperatures rise globally, the window for Vibrio growth just expands.
Exactly. And if you consume a raw oyster carrying high loads of Vibrio, it can cause severe gastrointestinal illness. And in individuals with compromised immune systems or underlying liver disease, it can enter the bloodstream and be rapidly fatal.
And it's not just naturally occurring bacteria either. Our sources outline the risks of norovirus and hepatitis A.
Which are definitely not natural to the ocean.
No. Those are introduced into the bivalves through human sewage runoff or improper handling by sick workers on the boat. And then there are the marine biotoxins from harmful algal blooms, the infamous red tides.
And here's a crucial, literal, life-saving distinction regarding those marine biotoxins, things like domoic acid or saxitoxin.
You're right. Listen to this part.
Cooking, boiling, frying, steaming will kill living pathogens like Vibrio bacteria and norovirus.
Right. Heat kills bacteria.
But heat does not destroy the molecular structure of marine biotoxins.
Wait, really?
Yes.
Yeah.
If a clam or oyster has filtered neurotoxins from a harmful algal bloom, boiling it in a chowder will not make it safe.
Oh my God.
It will still cause paralytic or amnesic shellfish poisoning.
Which is terrifying. And it means that eating a raw oyster or even a cooked clam from unknown waters is ultimately an act of profound trust.
It is the ultimate trust fall with the food system.
You are trusting the absolute purity of the water. You are trusting the farmer who grew it. You're trusting the state health regulators who test the bay water weekly. You're trusting the cold chain logistics, the truck drivers ensuring the refrigeration never dropped below 45 degrees. And you're trusting the shucker at the restaurant holding the knife.
It's an immense, highly fragile chain of trust. And that invisible chain relies on an equally invisible chain of human labor.
Let's talk about that.
Because that beautiful, expensive, icy platter of raw oysters sitting on a white tablecloth is supported by a workforce that almost never gets the spotlight.
Which leads us right into Section 6, the hidden labor and economics. Let's look at the numbers, because the economic engine of bivalves is staggering. The U.S. commercial fishing and seafood industry as a whole is a $173 billion economic machine. But the monetary value of a single bivalve changes wildly depending on where it sits in that supply chain.
Exactly. The value addition is entirely skewed to the very end of the chain.
How so?
At the dock, when an oyster farmer unloads a muddy bushel basket of oysters, it is simply priced as an agricultural commodity. The farmer might get, 50 or 60 cents per oyster.
Okay.
But by the time that exact same oyster is washed, transported, and placed on a silver platter at a raw bar in Manhattan or San Francisco, it has been transformed into a curated luxury experience.
Right.
The restaurant might charge $4 or $5 for that single oyster.
But that massive markup doesn't go back to the farmer, and it certainly doesn't go to the deckhands. It's absorbed by the distributors, the cold storage facilities, the branding agencies, and the high overhead of the restaurant.
Right.
And we really need to shine a bright light on the workers here, because the marketing around oysters always presents this incredibly romantic, pristine image.
Oh, totally. It's usually a lone, rugged, bearded farmer standing in a beautiful bay at sunrise, wearing expensive waders, holding up a perfect oyster to the light.
Exactly. And while those artisanal owner-operators absolutely exist, the reality of the broader industrial shellfish labor force is much harsher and much more hidden.
It involves brutal, freezing, repetitive motion work.
Right. If you look inside a large-scale processing plant or a commercial shucking house, you have workers standing for 8 to 10 hours a day in wet, freezing conditions.
And they are performing highly dangerous, rapid-fire knife work, forcefully prying the hinges off thousands of calcified shells a single day.
Which leads to severe carpal tunnel, lacerations, and chronic pain.
Yes. And in many sectors of the seafood industry, this backbreaking work relies heavily on migrant labor and seasonal H-2B visa workers,
who often face severe language barriers, lack of healthcare access, and highly precarious employment conditions where they really can't speak up about safety.
The contrast is just jarring. You have an animal that represents the absolute pinnacle of culinary luxury, being prepared by some of the most marginalized workers in the entire food system.
It makes me think of an analogy from our research notes. The oyster might be wearing a tuxedo when it's served as Oysters Rockefeller, dripping in butter and herbs on a silver platter. But the person who actually got it out of the mud and popped the shell is wearing frozen, cut-proof rubber gloves, standing on a wet concrete floor in a 40-degree room.
It's a stark disparity.
Yeah.
And that economic and social tension extends beyond just the labor force. It permeates the very concept of aquaculture itself.
How do you mean?
Well, because shellfish farming fundamentally relies on coastal waters, it creates a unique, highly contentious property conflict. Farmers are generally using public waters, the ocean commons, through private leases granted by the state to generate private profit.
Right. If you own a corn farm in Iowa, you own the land. You put up a fence, it's yours. But you can't own the ocean. It belongs to the public.
Precisely. And this partitioning of the marine commons creates profound friction. You have recreational boaters and sailors complaining about oyster cages, obstructing navigation channels.
Sure.
You have wealthy waterfront homeowners, classic NIMBism, right? Not in my backyard complaining that floating oyster bags and working boats ruin their pristine million-dollar views.
And on a much deeper level, you have indigenous communities who often find their ancestral fishing grounds, their traditional treaty waters, being partitioned off by state governments and leased to private commercial aquaculture companies.
It raises massive unresolved issues of environmental justice and food sovereignty.
It really forces society to ask, who does the coast actually belong to? Who has the right to extract value from the tide?
Which naturally pulls us into the deepest, most psychological and philosophical heart of this deep dive. Section 7. The moral mudflat.
This is where we have to confront the ethics of consuming these animals. I want to bring up the ultimate vegan dilemma that comes up constantly when discussing bivalves.
The bivalve vegan debate.
Yes, even among people who strictly avoid meat and dairy, you have bivalve vegans people who will still eat oysters and clams. So let's explore the biology of the ethics here. Is it morally okay to eat them? Do they feel pain?
That is the central philosophical debate. And to answer it, evolutionary biologists and ethicists draw a strict line between two concepts: nociception and sentience.
Okay, let's break those down. Nociception.
Nociception is simply the mechanical reflexibility of an organism's nervous system to detect and withdraw from a noxious or harmful stimulus.
Like a clam slamming its shell shut when a shadow passes over, or an oyster immediately retracting its mantle when it gets poked with a needle.
Exactly. Nociception is a baseline survival mechanism. Almost all animals, and honestly even some plants, have mechanisms to react to physical damage.
Right.
But sentience is vastly different. Sentience is the subjective, conscious, emotional experience of suffering. It is the internal feeling of pain.
So because oysters and clams completely lack a central brain or a complex cerebral cortex,
the general scientific consensus is that their capacity to consciously, subjectively suffer is highly uncertain, but biologically likely to be much, much lower than a vertebrate fish, a bird, or a mammal.
So from a strict pain capacity standpoint, some ethicists argue that dropping a clam into boiling water might be morally closer to chopping up a carrot than it is to slaughtering a cow.
That is the argument, yes. However, uncertainty demands respect.
Right. The precautionary principle.
Exactly. The precautionary principle in ethics suggests that just because we cannot definitively prove the presence or absence of subjective experience in simple animals, we shouldn't assume it's zero. We still owe them precautionary care.
Meaning we should minimize unnecessary waste, avoid pointlessly brutal handling, and respect the fact that they are living, responsive creatures.
Yes, and this shifts the ethical framework. The moral focus perhaps shouldn't just be on the localized suffering of the individual oyster on the plate.
The deeper ethical question is ecological.
Right. Are we managing the whole system in a way that restores the bay or degrades it? Are we honoring their labor?
Which brings us to one of the most fascinating psychological frameworks we found in the show's research notes. It's referred to as the Kelly archetype, or the Kelly subpersonality lens.
I love this part. This is such a profound way to contextualize everything we've discussed today.
We've been talking about invisible labor this whole time, the biological labor of the filter feeder, the physical labor of the shucker. In psychological terms, the Kelly archetype represents the steady empath.
The caregiver.
Exactly. This is the caregiver personality, the person in a family, an office, or a community who does the quiet, non-performative, but absolutely essential labor of holding the system together.
The one who absorbs it all.
Kelly's the one who absorbs and filters out the emotional toxicity of their environment, constantly nourishing others, but rarely demanding the spotlight, the applause, or the credit.
The mapping of that archetype onto oysters and clams is flawless. They are the Kellys of the ocean.
They really are.
Think about their evolutionary path. They aren't flashy. They weren't apex predators cutting through the water like a great white shark commanding all the attention.
No, they just sit quietly at the bottom.
They literally filter the murky, toxic water, metabolizing the excess and making the water clear and safe for everyone else. They build the physical foundations that allow the entire coastal ecosystem to thrive. They nourish the world through their sheer, steady existence.
And the metaphor extends even to the distinct types of bivalves, right? Clams represent that hidden, private, internalized resilience. They endure the harshness of the freezing tides by burying deep into the mud, quietly surviving and processing energy out of sight.
While oysters represent community building.
Right. They physically cannot survive alone. They must build their shells on top of one another, creating a collective, interwoven structure that shelters everyone else.
And consider the biology of the shell itself through this psychological lens. Both the human Kelly archetype and these marine bivalves possess soft, highly sensitive reactive interiors.
They are incredibly vulnerable to the shifting chemistry and moods of their environment.
So what do? They develop a hard outer shell. And in human psychological terms and in marine biological terms, that hard shell is not an act of aggression. It is not a weapon to hurt others.
It's a necessary boundary.
Exactly. It's the protective boundary required to shield that softness so that the organism can survive and continue to care for the broader system.
That is such a beautiful, cohesive way to look at it. The shell is a boundary that allows the softness to do its crucial work.
But the tragedy is that if we take those quiet providers for granted, whether they are human caregivers, marginalized workers, or billions of oysters in a bay, we risk destroying the very foundation we stand on.
Which brings up the final ethical question we have to ask about our relationship with nature. When does a harvest become an exploitation?
A harvest becomes an exploitation the exact moment we stop asking if the system can recover.
Wow.
Harvesting implies a relationship. It involves restraint, seasonality, and intentionally leaving enough biological capital behind for the system to regenerate.
And exploitation.
Exploitation, driven by industrial extraction, only asks one question. How much can be pulled out for maximum profit today? The historical loss of those massive, ancient East Coast oyster reefs to the iron dredges is a glaring historical warning.
It shows exactly what happens when a society takes its quietest, steadiest providers completely for granted, strip mining their labor until they burn out, their architecture collapses, and the entire ecosystem is left impoverished and vulnerable to collapse.
It is a lesson we are still desperately trying to internalize as we pivot to modern aquaculture, trying to rebuild what we so recklessly broke.
Which brings us to the end of this incredible deep dive. Let's kind of synthesize what we've unpacked today. We started by looking at what seemed like two faceless blobs of tissue.
But underneath the shells, we found ancient, brainless survivors that went the route of hardware over software, weathering 500 million years of planetary change.
We found ultimate ecosystem engineers that can literally build shorelines and filter the sea. We traced their wild human history, shape-shifting from sacred indigenous staples and architectural building blocks, to cheap industrial street food, to elite luxury items, and now to the front line of climate-resilient farming facing down ocean acidification.
They are quiet, profound teachers about humanity's relationship with the natural world.
They absolutely are. And as we close, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over.
Please do.
In our modern environmental movements, we spend so much time, funding, and emotional energy worrying about the charismatic animals. We put the polar bear, the blue whale, the tiger, and the panda on our donation posters. We care deeply about the animals with faces, the ones that can look back at us and instantly trigger our mammalian empathy.
Because we see ourselves in them. We can relate to a mother bear protecting her cubs.
Exactly. It's easy to advocate for what we understand, but oysters and clams ask a much harder, deeper moral question of us. Can our empathy and our environmental ethics extend to the faceless, the silent, and the muddy foundations of life?
Can we advocate for an animal that is essentially just a living rock with a physiological heartbeat?
The next time you look out at a calm coastal bay or walk along a tidal mudflat at low tide, I want you to ask yourself not just what magnificent, charismatic creature might be swimming out in the deep water, but who is quietly, invisibly doing the labor of keeping that water alive.
Who is doing the quiet work?
That is something that will stick with me every single time I see a crushed shell on the beach or sit down at a raw bar. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking beneath the surface, and we will catch you next time.